By dawn on the 3rd of June, the mist which the Nagumo force had encountered the previous afternoon had become a heavy blanket of fog. Steaming at fog navigation quarters, adjoining ships in the formation were often unable to see each other across their scant 600-yard intervals. Powerful searchlights were turned on, but they scarcely showed through the gloom. The task of maintaining zigzag courses through this endless veil, with only momentary and infrequent glimpses of consorting ships, was arduous and nerve-wracking. Yet it had to be done, for we were entering waters patrolled by enemy submarines. While the fog was advantageous in keeping us hidden from prying scout planes, this benefit was cancelled by the increased hazards of navigation. Moreover, the fog would not hamper the enemy's radar-equipped submarines, yet it prevented us from launching anti-submarine patrol planes. To cope with these and other problems that beset us, all ships were at full alert and double watches were posted at submarine lookout stations. The starboard side of Akaji's bridge was occupied by Admiral Nagumo and his entire staff. They stared silently at the impenetrable curtain surrounding the ship, and each face was tense with anxiety. Captain Aoki and his navigation officer, Commander Miura, on the other side of the bridge, devoted their entire energies to keeping the ship on course and maintaining position in the formation. From time to time they leaned out of the window in an effort to peer through the all-encompassing fog. A change in course was scheduled for 10:30, and it had to be executed if our timetable was to be carried out. Yet, prior to execution of such a course change in heavy fog, confirmation would have to be communicated to all ships in the formation lest some stray and become lost. With visibility so limited, flag signals obviously could not be employed, and even searchlights would be ineffective to transmit the required orders. Nothing remained but to use radio, which was sure to reveal our presence and position to the enemy, a matter of deep concern to Admiral Nagumo and his staff. This distressing situation served to bring out the fact that Nagumo had been assigned 2 tactical missions which were essentially incompatible. The assignment to attack Midway on the 5th of June in preparation for the landing operation put his force under rigid limitations of movement. The other mission to contact and destroy enemy naval forces required that Nagumo be entirely free to move as the situation required, and it also made it absolutely essential to keep our whereabouts secret while searching for the enemy. A decision obviously had to be made as to which of these missions should be given precedence. Nagumo's staff had pondered this problem hypothetically for a long time, but now the task force commander faced a situation requiring a definitive choice. And still there was not a scrap of information about enemy naval forces. In this critical situation, the senior member of the staff, Captain Oishi, was the first to speak up. The Combined Fleet Operation Order gives first priority to the destruction of enemy forces. Cooperation with the landing operation is secondary. But the same order specifically calls for our air attack on Midway Island on the 5th of June. This means that the air attack must be carried out exactly as scheduled, provided that no enemy task forces are located by the time we are ready to launch. If we do not neutralize the Midway-based air forces as planned, our landing operations 2 days later will be strongly opposed and the entire invasion schedule will be upset. With his usual directness, Admiral Nagumo voiced the question in everyone's mind. But where is the enemy fleet? In answer, Oishi continued, "We know nothing of the enemy's whereabouts because we failed to reconnoiter Pearl Harbor. But if his forces are now in Pearl Harbor, we shall have plenty of time to prepare to meet them should they sortie following our strike at Midway. They will have over 1,100 miles to cover. Even if they are already aware of our movements and have sortied to meet us, they cannot be far out from base at this moment and certainly can't be near us. I think, therefore, that the first thing for us to do is to carry out the scheduled raid on Midway." At this, Chief of Staff Kusaka turned to the intelligence officer and asked if radio intercepts had given any indication of enemy movements. Informed that nothing had been picked up, Kusaka asked if any information had been received from Combined Fleet flagship Yamato. Receiving another negative response, he addressed a suggestion to Admiral Nagumo. "Since we must maintain the schedule at all cost, would you approve the use of our low-powered, interfleet radio for sending the order to change course?" The commander assented to this as the only feasible solution, and the order was sent accordingly by medium-wave transmitter. A reduced power transmission would reach out to the fringe of our force and, it was hoped, not farther. This method was not entirely safe, but it had worked on occasion in the past, thanks to enemy carelessness. In this case, however, the message was received clearly even by Yamato, which was 600 miles to the rear. Inasmuch as an enemy task force was then only a few hundred miles distant, a fact of which we were totally unaware, it was highly probable that it, too, intercepted this signal. From the first, the planners of the Midway operation calculated that the enemy naval forces would be lured out by the strike on Midway Island and not before. We had not the slightest idea that the enemy had already sortied, much less that a powerful enemy force was lying in wait, ready to pounce upon us at any moment. Dense fog still hung over the Nagumo force throughout the afternoon and on into the night. In contrast to the tenseness prevailing on Akaji's bridge, her wardroom hummed with the lusty chatter and laughter of carefree flyers whose only job was to jump into their planes and roar off at a moment's notice. Everything was ready for the scheduled air raid 2 days hence, and no flight missions had been ordered because of the adverse weather. The pilots consequently had nothing to do and passed their time playing cards. Meanwhile, the weather around the Yamamoto force, 600 miles astern, improved somewhat in the afternoon, and refueling, which had been suspended on the preceding day, was resumed. The worst thing about the persistent fog was that it cloaked enemy movements in complete secrecy. As previously mentioned, the plan for a flying boat reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor on the 31st of May, using French frigate shoals as a refueling point, had been thwarted. Nor did our submarines provide any information. The sole remaining source of information was radio intelligence. As early as the 30th of May, such intelligence picked up by Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato had pointed to brisk enemy activity in the Hawaii area, especially of patrol planes. This strongly suggested the possibility of a sortie by an enemy force from the Hawaiian base, but combined fleet sent no warning whatever to Admiral Nagumo. Admiral Nagumo and his staff were deeply chagrined when they learned after the battle that because of this radio intelligence Combined Fleet Headquarters had suspected an enemy sortie. Why did Combined Fleet not transmit this vital information to the carrier striking force so that any danger of its being taken by surprise might be averted? There were 2 reasons behind this unfortunate failure. Firstly, Combined Fleet Headquarters thoughtlessly believed that Akaji, closer to the enemy than Yamato, would naturally have obtained the same information, and that Admiral Nagumo was formulating his decisions accordingly. Secondly, they feared that radio communication between the 2 forces would reveal their positions to the enemy. At any rate, Admiral Yamamoto's failure to issue necessary precautionary instructions to the forces under his command was an important cause of the Midway fiasco. He was to blame for being too much preoccupied with the idea of radio silence. It is easy to imagine what angry and bitter emotions must have welled up in Rear Admiral Kusaka when he went on board Yamato after the battle to report on the near annihilation of the Nagumo force and there learned for the first time of Combined Fleet's negligence. While might he have said, "My God! How often I told them not to let this happen. If only they had let us know in time." Combined Fleet Headquarters, however, was not alone to blame. The Naval General Staff back in Tokyo was also partially responsible, for it again sent a radio to Combined Fleet concerning enemy fleet activity in the Solomon Islands area. The message carried the strong implication that the movement of the Japanese forces toward Midway was not yet suspected by the enemy. The Naval General Staff had originally opposed the Midway operation, but once having given its approval, it was responsible for the whole operation even more than was Combined Fleet Headquarters. With the decisive battle only a few days off, it was engaged in gathering all available intelligence regarding enemy activity. What particularly attracted the attention of the intelligence staff was indications that an American carrier task force still was operating in the Solomons area. If this were true, as the Naval General Staff believed, it constituted powerful evidence that the enemy did not yet suspect our intention, for if he did, he would obviously have called all his scarce remaining carriers back from the Southwest Pacific. Even after intercepting a number of urgent calls from American radios in the Hawaii Midway area, the Naval General Staff still stuck fast to its first conclusion. This was perhaps due to the inherent Japanese tendency toward wishful thinking, which permeated our actions throughout the war. The storm of battle was about to break, and for the first time in 6 months, fate did not seem to be smiling upon us. No change, however, was made in the operational plan. All forces plunged onward through the boundless fog like stagecoach horses driven blindly forward by a cracking whip. If Admiral Yamamoto and his staff were vaguely disturbed by the persistent bad weather and by lack of information concerning the doings of the enemy, they would have been truly dismayed had they known the actual enemy situation. Post-war American accounts make it clear that the United States Pacific Fleet knew of the Japanese plan to invade Midway even before our forces had sortied from home waters. As a result of some amazing achievements by American intelligence, the enemy had succeeded in breaking the principal code then in use by the Japanese Navy. In this way, the enemy was able to learn of our intentions almost as quickly as we had determined them ourselves. In early May, the enemy knew that another major operation was being planned by the Japanese fleet, to be carried out by the end of that month or early in June. The precise objective of this operation was not known at first, but by the middle of May the enemy had not only learned that the Japanese target was Midway but also had ascertained with considerable accuracy the makeup of forces to be employed. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief U.S. Pacific Fleet, personally visited the island in early May and took steps towards strengthening the garrison forces and adding to the defense facilities and fortifications. By early June, Midway plane strength had been augmented by the arrival of 16 Marine Corps dive bombers, 7 Wildcat fighters, some 30 Navy patrol flying boats, and 18 B-17s and 4 B-26s from the Army. More than 2,000 garrison troops were deployed ashore, and many anti-aircraft batteries were installed. A number of motor torpedo boats were also brought in to be employed for short-range coastal patrol and night attack missions. In addition, 3 submarine patrol arcs were set up at distances of 100,000, 150 and 200 miles from Midway, with a total of 20 submarines on stations by the 4th of June. The United States Pacific Fleet was determined to oppose the invasion of Midway with all the strength that it could muster. On this point, the calculations of combined fleet had been entirely correct. Midway was so important to the safety of Hawaii that the American fleet could not let it be taken without a battle. Advanced knowledge of Japanese intentions was an important advantage, but nevertheless the prospects confronting the American forces were hardly promising. The Japanese forces to be committed were overwhelmingly superior, and the American carrier situation was critical. Lexington had just been sunk in the Battle of the Coral Sea, and in the same engagement Yorktown had sustained damage which made it problematical whether she could get back to Pearl Harbor for repair in time to participate in Midway's defense. Saratoga was still at San Diego, where she had undergone repairs for torpedo damage inflicted by a Japanese submarine on the 11th of January some 500 miles southwest of Oahu. This left only Hornet and Enterprise which, after returning from the raid on the Japanese homeland in April, had been ordered out to the Southwest Pacific to join in the operations in the Coral Sea. Accordingly, Pacific Fleet Headquarters urgently ordered Task Forces 16 centered around Hornet and Enterprise and 17 to return at once to Pearl Harbor. Task Force 16 arrived on the 26th of May, coincident with the sortie of the Nagumo force from the Inland Sea, and Task Force 17 came in early in the afternoon of the following day. Yorktown went immediately into dry dock where repair crews swung into action in a furious race against time. After refueling and hasty battle preparations, Task Force 16, now commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, sortied from Pearl Harbor on the 28th of May, just as the Yamamoto and Kondo forces were leaving Hashirajima, and headed for the waters northeast of Midway. In addition to Hornet and Enterprise, the task force contained 5 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 9 destroyers. By afternoon of the next day repairs to Yorktown had miraculously been completed. She then fueled, took on a quickly organized air complement and sortied in the morning of the 30th of May with 2 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers as Task Force 17, Rear Admiral Frank J. Fletcher in command. These 2 forces were to rendezvous on the 3rd of June, refuel and then proceed under Fletcher's overall command to a point northeast of Midway by the morning of the next day. In the light of these facts, it is obvious that the second Operation K, on which Combined Fleet had placed so much reliance, would have been of no avail even if it had been carried out. The flying boats, which were to arrive over Pearl Harbor at 01:15 on the 31st of May, would have been too late to catch either Spruance's or Fletcher's forces. Indeed, execution of the reconnaissance as planned might have had worse results than no reconnaissance at all, for the complete absence of carrier strength at Pearl Harbor might have led Admiral Yamamoto to the mistaken conclusion that the enemy forces were still where they had last been reported, in the southwest Pacific. This delusion would have been furthered by the fact that, on the 1st of June, Admiral Yamamoto received from the Naval General Staff in Tokyo a dispatch which gave its considered judgment that an enemy carrier force was still operating in the vicinity of the Solomon Islands. And what about the submarine cordons? As far as can be determined from the American records available to the authors, it appears possible, though by no means certain, that the sortie of the American forces toward Midway might have been detected had the Japanese submarines been on station by the scheduled date of the 2nd of June. By the 4th, however, when they actually did move into position, the enemy carrier groups were to the north of Midway, well beyond the cordon lines, waiting to strike at the flank of the unsuspecting Japanese forces. The trouble, of course, lay in the fact that the entire Japanese invasion plan, including the provisions for the flying boat reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor and the submarine cordons, was based on the assumption that tactical surprise would be achieved and that enemy fleet reaction would not get underway until after the assault on Midway had begun. Combined fleet planners completely failed to provide for the contingency that the enemy might somehow learn of our intentions in advance and thus be able to deploy his forces for an ambush attack. This failure must be ascribed, more than anything else, to the arrogant overconfidence engendered by our early victories. We were accustomed to success and so sure of our superior strength that no thought was given to the possibility that things might not go exactly as we had planned. The enemy, too, was confident despite the heavy odds in our favor. In a message to the officers and men of Task Forces 16 and 17 on the eve of their sortie from Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz declared that the coming operation will give you a chance to deal a mighty blow to the enemy. Admiral Spruance, on the 3rd of June, also issued the following exhortation to his command: an attack for the purpose of capturing Midway is expected. The attacking force may be composed of all combat types, including 4 or 5 carriers, transports and train vessels. If the presence of Task Forces 16 and 17 remains unknown to the enemy, we should be able to make surprise flank attacks on the enemy carriers from a position northeast of Midway. Further operations will be based on the result of these attacks, damage inflicted by Midway forces, and information of enemy movements. The successful conclusion of the operation now commencing will be of great value to our country. Should our carriers become separated during attacks by enemy aircraft, they will endeavor to remain within visual touch. From the first day of June, Midway-based planes patrolled in search of the Japanese invasion forces, covering a semicircle to the west to a radius of 600 miles. Their searches were, of course, hampered by the fog through which the Japanese forces were approaching. But the Americans, whom we believed to be unknowing and unprepared, were in reality apprised of our intentions and standing by in full readiness to attack when the time was right. The curtain was now ready to lift on a battle that would teach us a tragic lesson. The steady rain which had been falling on the main force finally let up on the 3rd of June, but the sky still looked sullen and threatening. At 08, according to plan, Admiral Yamamoto ordered Vice Admiral Takasu's guard force to break off from the main body and proceed to cover the Aleutians operations. Takasu was to reach a point 500 miles south of Kiska Island by the 6th of June, at which time Admiral Yamamoto's main body would be in its planned position 500 miles farther south. The plan provided for the two forces to rejoin in case of a concerted enemy counterattack in either area. Within an hour after the split-up of the main force, Admiral Yamamoto received a sudden message from Admiral Tanaka's flagship Jintsu, which was in direct escort of the Midway transport convoy, reporting that the convoy had been discovered at 09 by an enemy search plane over 600 miles west of the target island. Tanaka reported that the enemy flying boat had clung tenaciously to the transports until heavy anti-aircraft fire from Jintsu's companion warships forced it to break off the contact. This development altered the entire aspect of the operation. A part of our forces had now been definitely discovered and, in all probability, its location had been reported. It was clear that action could be expected and soon. It came that afternoon when a flight of 9 bomb-laden B-17s attacked the transport convoy. Fortunately no hits were scored, and the transports proceeded on their way. Everyone in the convoy breathed a deep sigh of relief. Early in the morning of the 4th, however, other enemy planes came and made a low-level attack. One released a torpedo which hit the bow of Akebono Maru, a tanker at the rear of the transport column. The resulting explosion was powerful enough to kill 11 men and wound 13. But it must have been a partial dud since material damage to the ship was negligible. She was slowed down only momentarily and did not lose her place in the formation. As reports of these developments were flashed to Yamato in rapid succession, signs of concern began to show on the faces of Yamamoto's staff. Just a short time before they had been beaming with optimism over the prospects of the forthcoming battle. But now things were looking less rosy. They had not expected that the transports would be discovered before Nagumo had launched his attack against Midway. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that the discovery was contrary to their hopes rather than their expectations. The Midway operation plan had provided for the slowed transports to be sent out well ahead of the carrier striking force. Thus they were especially susceptible of premature discovery by the enemy. One way to avoid this danger would have been to advance the departure of the Nagumo force by 1 day, so that American air strength at Midway could be neutralized before the convoy came within range of the island's search planes. Combined Fleet planners had actually considered this modification and proposed it to Admiral Nagumo. But he had counter-proposed that the departure of the transports be delayed 1 day instead. Admiral Yamamoto rejected this suggestion because the landing had been planned for the last favorable day of the lunar phase and could not be postponed. Hence, with some misgivings, the original plan was adhered to. By the time that detection of the Midway transport convoy had foreshadowed the opening of battle to the south, the Japanese diversionary thrust against the Aleutians was already underway. Rear Admiral Kakuta's second carrier striking force, spearheading the northern thrust, reached its scheduled launching position for the strike on Dutch Harbor in the very early hours of the 3rd of June. Sunrise was at 0258. And all preparations to take off were completed 45 minutes earlier to take advantage of the long northern twilight. But the sky, to the disappointment of the crews, did not show first light as expected. On the bridge of flagship Ryujo, Captain Tadao Kato, in a heavy fur coat, was giving last-minute orders to the attack unit commanders. Not only was the enemy situation unknown, but the flyers, who had never operated in the northern Pacific before, did not even know what sort of weather conditions to expect. Rear Admiral Kakuta anxiously patted the shoulder of the staff aviation officer, Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, to attract his attention amidst the roar of the plane engines warming up on the flight deck, and inquired what he thought about launching the attack. "Please, sir, we will have to wait a little longer," Okumiya replied. He looked at his watch to find that it was 0228, but still the sky had not begun to brighten. Kakuta's senior staff officer, Commander Masanori Odagiri, who had been staring skyward for several minutes, commented that there seemed to be a fog. His observation proved correct and served to explain the continuing darkness. With aircraft carrier Ryujo in the lead, the task force was approaching Dutch Harbor at 22 knots. The mercury stood at 7 degrees below 0 centigrade. Lieutenant Commander Okumiya frowned as he thought of the handicaps under which the attack was being executed. For one thing, the flyers were provided with maps of the Dutch harbor area copied from a chart over 30 years old. The only other guide the Japanese had was a single photograph almost as old as the map. Many shoreline portions of the target island were shown on the map by dotted lines, indicating unsurveyed places. The island was actually unknown to us even in outline. Could the pilots find such a target in bad weather? Failure to locate the targets would mean that there would also be difficulty in getting back to the carriers, and some of the planes might get lost. But this was war. The Japanese forces had come so far for the sake of victory, and there must be no lack of resolution now. Despite the fog, the attack must be launched at the first increase in visibility. Okumiya glanced at the sky with growing impatience. At 0238 the shapes of the other ships in the formation began gradually to come into sight. The admiral seemed anxious to order the planes off immediately, but his staff officers still remained silent. By 0243 light carrier Junyo, 1,000 meters distant, became clearly visible and Okumiya shouted, "Sir, we can launch now." The admiral nodded and looked toward the signal officer, Lieutenant Commander Okada, who ordered, "Squadrons, take off for attack." Blinker signals flashed from the flagship. Planes rose methodically from the flight decks into the misty haze. From Ryujo 11 bombers and 6 fighters took off, from Junyo 12 dive bombers and 6 fighters, all planes under command of Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga. A cloud ceiling of only 500,700 feet made formation flight impossible, so the planes headed independently for Dutch Harbor, some 180 miles to the northeast. The day had dawned, but still the sun failed to appear. One of the Ryujo bombers crashed into the icy sea while taking off, but prompt action by an escorting destroyer resulted in the miraculous rescue of the entire crew. The attack planes were barely out of sight when enemy scouts began to fly over the Kakuta force. A flying boat maintained close contact through the fog and dropped bombs before finally withdrawing, but there were no hits. Lieutenant Masayuki Yamagami's group from Ryujo managed to weave through breaks in the clouds and reach Dutch Harbor despite the weather. Luckily the clouds directly over the target lay wide agape. But there were no enemy planes or ships to be seen. At 04:07 the bombers attacked a radio station and oil tanks, while fighters strafed a flying boat moored in the water. All planes got back to the carrier except one fighter, which was hit while strafing and made a forced landing on the southern shore of Acton Island, 20 miles northeast of Dutch Harbor. The pilot's neck was broken in the landing. 5 weeks later an American Navy search party found the plane, which was only superficially damaged. Junyo's planes, led by Lieutenant Shiga, encountered an enemy flying boat on their way to the target. The escorting fighters shot it down, but the resultant delay, coupled with the bad weather, kept Shiga's group from reaching Dutch Harbor, and it returned without attacking any land targets. The opening attacks thus fell short of anticipated results. Aerial photographs taken during the attack, however, provided a real surprise. They showed Dutch Harbor to be far better equipped than had been imagined. There were modern warehouses, barracks, wharves, and fuel storage tanks, with a network of excellent connecting roads. The well-developed roadways alone bore eloquent testimony to the strategic value of these enemy installations. On their way back from Dutch Harbor, Yamagami's planes radioed in that they had spotted 5 enemy destroyers at anchor in Mikushin Bay, on the northern coast of central Unalaska Island. Rear Admiral Kakuta, who was noted for his promptness in engaging any enemy that appeared, ordered an attack on the destroyers with all available planes. Not only the squadrons of the 2 carriers, but even seaplanes from heavy cruisers Takao and Maya, were ordered to take part. A total of 24 planes actually headed for the target, but foul weather along the way forced most of them to turn back. Soon after the planes took off on this second mission, the weather closed in again, and even neighboring ships occasionally could not see one another. The attack planes, unable to keep formation, returned in scattered small groups crawling just above the sea. Most of their engines were wheezing and coughing because of the freezing cold as they returned over the carriers. The men in the ships held their breath as they watched the planes stagger down onto the flight deck one after another. Once all the carrier planes were on board, the Kakuta force continued to advance until it was some 100 miles from the enemy shore. Meanwhile, the 4 Type 95 two-seater reconnaissance seaplanes from Takao and Maya had continued their daring advance through the stormy weather. They were intercepted by enemy fighters, however, and a dogfight ensued in which 2 of them were downed and the other 2 suffered some damage, though they managed to return near their ships. Both the crippled planes broke up in the water the moment they landed, but the injured crewmen were rescued. Thus ended the first day's operations in the northern area. It was now clear that the Americans had air bases on or near Unalaska, but their location was as completely unknown as that of the hidden stars beyond the thick fog. The Dutch Harbor attack had inflicted little actual damage on the enemy. More important, it proved entirely ineffective in achieving its diversionary objective, since the Americans were already well aware that the main Japanese attack was directed at Midway. Far to the south, the submarine elements assigned to the A and B cordon lines between Midway and the main Hawaiian Islands at last took up their stations during the 3rd of June, 2 days behind schedule. Each submarine remained submerged during the day and surfaced at night, never relaxing its lookout for enemy forces coming from the direction of Pearl Harbor. But they had arrived too late. The enemy ships had already passed the positions of the cordons and moved far to the west. Meanwhile, the afternoon of the 3rd found the Nagumo force heading southeast for Midway at 24 knots. The force was cruising in a compact ring formation with the 4 carriers in the center. The perimeter was formed by battleships Haruna and Kirishima, heavy cruisers Tone and Chikuma, light cruiser Nagara, and 12 destroyers. Suddenly, at 1940, heavy cruiser Tone hoisted an urgent signal reporting approximately 10 enemy planes sighted on bearing 260. 3 Akaji fighters took off immediately to intercept, but as they encountered no enemy planes and as no air attack came, it was concluded that Tone's report had been erroneous. After this brief alarm, the force continued on undisturbed until 0230, the 4th of June. Then one of Akagi's lookouts reported what appears to be the light of an enemy contact plane sighted on starboard beam, bearing 070, above the clouds. Approaching. Every man on the bridge strained his eyes in the reported direction, but nothing was in sight. Nevertheless, Captain Aoki, who had not once left the bridge since departing from the homeland, instantly ordered general quarters, and all hands hurried to their stations. Stars, both bright and dim, blinked through the scattered clouds and gained motion from the roll of the ship. After half a minute of futile watching and waiting, the captain called the lookout and asked if he still saw the reported light. A slight pause preceded the reluctant reply, "No, sir, I have lost it." The captain then cautioned all lookouts against mistaking stars for moving lights due to the motion of the ship. "Make sure of your sightings before reporting," he ordered. Mumbled responses indicated that the lookouts understood the warning, and again there was silence. The captain was about to secure the ship from general quarters when the same lookout suddenly shouted another warning light sighted in the same direction. "It is not a star." An anti-aircraft alert order was immediately flashed to all ships of the force. But again all efforts to confirm the presence of an enemy plane proved vain. Now 0 hour for launching the strike on Midway was rapidly approaching. Promptly at 0245, Akagi's loudspeakers barked an order turning out aircrews assigned to the attack. Maintenance men were already preparing the planes for takeoff, and there was a deafening roar of motors starting and warming up. The noise and pre-takeoff excitement throughout the ship roused Commander Genda, Staff Operations Officer, who had been confined to sick bay shortly after our departure because of a high fever which, it was feared, betokened pneumonia. Now, unwilling to miss the launching of the attack, he made his way to the bridge. There he encountered Admiral Nagumo, who placed an arm around his shoulder and asked how he was feeling. "I am very sorry, sir, to have been absent so long. I have a slight temperature but am feeling much better now." Genda's feverish eyes betrayed that he was much sicker than he was willing to admit, but they also sparkled with fighting spirit. Genda's appearance on the bridge was a moving inspiration to every man present. For more than 6 months he had played a leading role in planning and directing the successful operations of the Nagumo force. It bolstered the morale of everyone to see him again at Admiral Nagumo's side, ready for battle. With his attack groups about to take off for Midway, Admiral Nagumo still was without information of enemy fleet activity. Wartime records disclose that just prior to launching the attack, Admiral Nagumo estimated or, rather, misestimated the enemy situation as follows: the enemy fleet will probably come out to engage when the Midway landing operations are begun. Enemy air patrols from Midway will be heavier to westward and southward, less heavy to the north and northwest. The radius of enemy air patrols is estimated to be approximately 500 miles. The enemy is not yet aware of our plan, and he has not yet detected our task force. There is no evidence of an enemy task force in our vicinity. It is therefore possible for us to attack Midway, destroy land-based planes there, and support the landing operation. We can then turn around, meet an approaching enemy task force, and destroy it. Possible counterattacks by enemy land-based air can surely be repulsed by our interceptors and anti-aircraft fire. Such was the sad misjudgment under which Admiral Nagumo, through no fault of his own, led the proud Japanese carrier striking force into a battle that would see it smashed beyond repair. At about 3 on the morning of the 4th of June, the noisy drone of plane engines warming up roused me from slumber. I got out of bed and attempted to stand, but my legs were still unsteady. The sound of engines alternately hummed and then rose to a whining roar. Akagi was preparing to launch her planes for the attack on Midway. Unable to resist the desire to be topside at takeoff time, I slipped out of the sick bay. The watertight doors of every bulkhead had been closed, leaving only a small manhole in each door open for passage. It was an arduous task to squeeze through these small openings in my weakened condition, and cold sweat soon ran down my forehead. I frequently felt exhausted and dizzy and had to squat on the floor to rest. The passageways were empty. All hands were at their stations. Lights were dimmed for combat condition, and one could see a distance of only a few feet. With great effort I finally climbed the ladders up to my cabin just below the flight deck, clutching the handrails every step of the way. There I paused long enough to catch my breath and put on a uniform before going on to the flight control post. The first wave attack planes were all lined up on the flight deck. The warm-up was completed, and the roar of the engines subsided. I found Commander Masuda, air officer of Akagi, in charge of flight preparations. My colleagues expressed concern over my leaving bed, but they understood when I explained that I could not bear to hear the sound of the engines and remain below in sick bay. I looked up at the dark sky. The dawn still seemed far off. The sky was cloudy, and the weather, while not good, was not bad enough to prevent flying. The sea was calm. I asked Lieutenant Furukawa when sunrise would be. At 05, sir, was the reply. Have search planes already been sent out? No, sir. They will be launched at the same time as the first attack wave. Are we using the single-phase search system? Yes, sir. As usual. I recalled the attacks on Colombo and Trincomalee in the Indian Ocean, 2 months earlier, when single-phase search had been employed. It had not been a wise tactic. In both instances, the searches had spotted enemy surface forces while our attack groups were away hitting the enemy bases, and this had caused our carriers some anxious moments. With this in mind, I inquired what plans had been made for the eventuality that our search planes might sight an enemy fleet during the Midway attack. No need to worry about that, Lieutenant Commander Murata replied. After the first attack wave departs, the second wave, consisting of Lieutenant Commander Aguza's dive bombers, my torpedo bombers, and Lieutenant Commander Itaya's Zeros, will be available to attack any enemy surface force that might be discovered. I see. Well, that's a good team. And we can just hope that the enemy fleet does come out so we can destroy it. What searches are scheduled? Furukawa explained them to me on the map board. There are 7 lines extending east and south, with Midway lying within the search arc. We are using 1 plane each from Akagi and Kaga, 2 seaplanes each from Tone and Shikuma, and 1 from Haruna. The search radius is 300 miles for all planes except Haruna's, which is a Type 95 and can do only half that. Although the coverage appeared adequate, I still felt that a 2-phase search would have been wiser. A single-phase search might be sufficient if we wished only to confirm our assumption that no enemy fleet was in the vicinity. However, if we recognized the possibility that this assumption might be wrong and that an enemy force might be present, our searches should have been such as to assure that we could locate and attack it before it could strike at us. For this purpose, a 2-phase dawn search was the logical answer. As the term indicates, a 2-phase search employs 2 sets of planes which fly the same search lines, with a given time interval between them. Since our planes were not equipped with radar at this time, they were completely reliant on visual observation and could search effectively only by daylight. Consequently, to spot an enemy force as soon as possible after dawn, it was necessary to have 1 set of planes launched in time to reach the end of their search radius as day was breaking. This meant that the areas traversed in darkness on their outbound flight remained unsearched. Hence, a second-phase search was required over these same lines by planes taking off about 1 hour later. Men assigned to the first phase of such a search obviously had to be well trained in night flying. Nagumo had such pilots and could have used this method, but it would have required twice as many planes as a single-phase search. Despite the importance of conducting adequate searches, our naval strategists were congenitally reluctant to devote more than a bare minimum of their limited plane strength to such missions. 10% of total strength was all they were willing to spare for search operations, feeling that the rest should be reserved for offensive use. But such overemphasis on offensive strength had proven detrimental to our purposes before this, and it would again. Naturally enough, Admiral Nagumo was eager to devote maximum strength to the Midway attack and did not want to use any more planes for search than seemed absolutely necessary. Since he had no reason to suspect the presence of an enemy force in the area, he was satisfied that a single-phase search was adequate precaution against the unexpected. Search planes from Akagi and Kaga were launched at 0430, simultaneously with the departure of the first Midway attack wave. Haruna's seaplane was also catapulted at this time. But the Tone and Shikuma planes, which were covering the center lines of the search pattern, were delayed. Watching the 2 cruisers, I noticed that the last of their search planes did not get off until just before sunrise, nearly half an hour behind schedule. It was later learned that Tone's planes had been held up by catapult trouble, while one of Chikuma's planes had a Baki engine. This last plane was forced to turn back at 0635 when the engine trouble recurred and it ran into foul weather, Although poorly advised, a one-phase search dispatched half an hour before sunrise would still have been helpful if everything had worked out as planned. But the delay in launching Tone's planes sowed a seed which bore fatal fruit for the Japanese in the ensuing naval action. Reviewing the full story of the battle on both sides, we now know that the enemy task force was missed by Chikuma's search plane which, according to the plan, should have flown directly over it. The enemy force was discovered only when the belated Tone plane, on the line south of the Chikuma plane, was on the dog leg of its search. Had Admiral Nagumo carried out an earlier and more carefully planned two-phase search, had the observer of the Chikuma plane been more watchful on the outward leg of his search, or had the seaplanes been catapulted on schedule, the disaster that followed might have been avoided. The fundamental cause of this failure, again, lay in the Japanese Navy's overemphasis on attack, which resulted in inadequate attention to search and reconnaissance. In both the training and organization of our naval aviators, too much importance and effort were devoted to attack. Reconnaissance was taught only as part of the regular curriculum, and no subsequent special training was given. Also, there were no organic reconnaissance units of any appreciable size in the Japanese Navy. When reconnaissance missions were required, attack planes were usually refitted and assigned to perform them. There were no carrier-borne planes designed solely for search. In the Pearl Harbor attack, every carrier-borne bomber of Nagumo's 6 carriers was assigned to the attack, leaving for search only some 10 odd float planes from the accompanying battleships and cruisers. This had been perhaps the basic reason for Admiral Nagumo's decision to withdraw upon that occasion without exploiting his advantage. At the critical moment, when he had to decide whether to launch another attack on Pearl Harbor, he did not have the vital information which reconnaissance planes could have provided. The Nagumo force continued to suffer from this same lack of aerial reconnaissance in every action that followed. While searching for the British fleet in the Indian Ocean earlier in the year, our search planes often lost their way, and the carriers had to send out radio signals on which they could home. This, however, also alerted the enemy to our position, and the result was an understandable reluctance on the part of Admiral Nagumo and his staff to send out search planes if it could possibly be avoided. This reluctance was still present in the Midway operation, and, coupled with the erroneous estimate of the enemy situation, was responsible for the inadequate search dispositions ordered by Admiral Nagumo. One small step toward remedying the search weakness of the Nagumo force had been taken prior to the sortie for Midway. After prolonged negotiations with the authorities, Nagumo had succeeded in getting 2 carrier-based reconnaissance planes of a new type, on which experiments had just been completed. This type had been designed originally as a dive bomber, but was altered for use as a search plane. It was later designated the Type 2 carrier-borne reconnaissance plane or Susei dive bomber, and there were high expectations for its success in reconnoitering enemy task forces. 2 of these planes had been loaded on board Soryu before departure.